So welcome back. Welcome back. And we want to extend greetings to everybody out there in Zoom land and acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, and the American Philosophical Society. And special thanks to our member, Robert Hauser, a member of APS and its executive officer, for allowing APS to host this on its Zoom function because of the number of people we've had sign up, which exceeds the number we can accommodate on our paltry club Zoom account. I have a few announcements to make of upcoming club events. Those are not club members will excuse me. Of course, we welcome Philadelphia club members zooming in. And these are upcoming events for the next few weeks of March. Our annual Mardi Gras luncheon is on March the 1st. March 2nd is the Philadelphia Club dinner before the Orpheus Club midwinter concert. On March the 4th, we have another of our reciprocal visits to our reciprocal clubs. This one is dinner in New York at the Union Club. Our bi-monthly movie nights run by George Strimmel, who I'm happy to see here today, continue on March 8th with the film from 1954, a British film, Happily Ever After. On March the 11th, our next speaker luncheon will feature Richard Vague, Secretary of Banking and Securities for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we thank our member, David Seltzer, for recommending Richard. Richard's latest book is an illustrated business history of the United States. And on March 19th, we have our annual black or white tie Founders Day dinner, and that's on a Saturday. We look forward to seeing the members on that occasion. Now, there's some more seats down in front here, Ted. Thank you. Okay. Today, I have the honor of introducing an historian very well known in this community, particularly for his past books on Churchill, Walking with Destiny, Napoleon the Great, The Storm of War, Salisbury, Victorian Titan, and a history of the English-speaking peoples since 1900. Andrew Roberts is the Roger and Martha Mertz Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, a Lehrman Institute Distinguished Fellow at the New York Historical Society, and a visiting professor at the War Studies Department at King's College, London. Almost as good as being a speaker of the Philadelphia Club. He's written 19 books. I only gave you a few of the titles. He's made numerous television and radio appearances, including the 3-part BBC 2 series on Napoleon. He took a first-class honors degree in modern history at Gonville and Keyes, where he is an honorary senior scholar and holds a doctor of philosophy. We thank our member James Hill, also a graduate of Keyes, for recommending Andrew as a speaker today. His subject will be The Last King of America, the misunderstood reign of George III. And we quipped earlier today that he's a brave man coming to Philadelphia, which was occupied for 9 months by British troops. And we look forward to your rehabilitating our late monarch.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be invited to address you this afternoon, and thank you very much indeed, Jay, for those kind words, and especially for telling me that this was the largest turnout for 2 years, and not mentioning that there was a pandemic. That's very sweet of you. When I told my wife that I was coming here, she said, "So you're going to try and make Americans like Mad King George?" And I said, "Yes, darling." And she said, "Well, if you pull that one off, then King Herod is going to get into to see whether or not you can make him Parent of the Year." We know three things about George III, don't we? He had porphyria, this terrible mental illness, that because he was mad, and also because he was obstinate, he lost the American colonies for Britain, and also that he deserved to, because we know that from the Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence that he was unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And we also have the other unimpeachable historical documents saying the same thing about his tyranny, Hamilton the Musical by Miranda. Ladies and gentlemen, all three of those things are completely wrong. He did not have porphyria. He actually suffered, this comes from a series of misleading symptoms that were given by a mother and son medical team in the late 1960s. And so the doctors misdiagnosed essentially this disease as porphyria, which it was not. And that was picked up later by Alan Bennett and the movie and so on. In fact, what he suffered from, and I go into this in some detail in the appendix of my book, was bipolar disorder, affective type 1, a form of manic depression. And even though he had this, it had no effect whatsoever on the American Revolution, because his first outbreak of this didn't happen until 1788, 5 years after he had become independent. But most importantly, he was not a tyrant. It's perfectly understandable why the founding fathers should have, in attempting to clothe themselves in the mantle of the great English revolutionaries of 1642 against Charles I and 1688 against James II, have tried to present him as some kind of a Stuart absolutist monarch. But he simply was not one. He was somebody who did not believe in the divine right of kings, somebody who did believe in the limited monarchy of the 1688 revolution. The Declaration of Independence is a beautiful document. That first third of it is Shakespearean, it's sublime, it makes you proud to be human. But the second two-thirds of it contain a series of 28 ad hominem attacks on George III, only 2 of which he's guilty of. There are a series of ex post facto rationalizations of things that he's accused of that every English monarch was guilty of, going back to Elizabeth I. At one point, he's actually accused of taking Americans across the oceans for trial, when not a single American was taken across any ocean for trial in the whole reign of George III. So you have this sort of essential padding out of the lawyer's brief in the Declaration, the second half of the 2/3 of the Declaration. But the 2 key clauses of which he was undoubtedly guilty, the 17th about taxation and the 22nd about Parliament's veto rights over American legislation, in and of themselves justify the American Revolution. It was right for America to become independent in the 1770s. You had a population of 2.5 million, you had a burgeoning 7% year-on-year growth, you had more bookshops in this city of Philadelphia than in any other city of the empire apart from London. And so it was the right moment for America to become independent. But that doesn't mean that, that George III was a tyrant. There are plenty of tyrants in history at that time. You can look at Catherine the Great, who killed 50,000 people at the time of the Pugachev uprising. The modern Tsar is probably trying to outdo that number as we speak. You can see the French in Corsica at the time, what the Spanish did when they wiped out all of the leaders of the New Orleans uprising, what the Austrians and the Prussians were doing in Poland. There was genuine tyranny. However, George III did not try to close any American newspapers, arrest an American editor. He didn't try to prevent the Stamp Act Congress or the First Continental Congress from taking place. He didn't send troops to any city of America apart from Boston in 1768 before the outbreak of the Revolution. He didn't act in the way that a tyrant would. I was very fortunate in the course of researching this book that Her Majesty the Queen in 2015 put no fewer than 200,000 pages of the what's called the Georgian Papers programme online. And it's a wonderful collaboration between the Royal Archives and the King's College London, where I'm very proud to be a visiting fellow. And suddenly you have this cornucopia of information that's been made available, which entirely alters our view of the personality, the character of George III. And I'd just like to read you two sentences from an essay that I discovered in those papers that he wrote when he was in his Prince of Wales in the 1750s. And he was making a comment on Montesquieu's essays on the laws when he wrote this. What shall we say for a European traffic in black slaves? The very reasons urged for it will be perhaps sufficient to make us hold such practice in execration. For an inhuman custom, wantonly practiced by the most enlightened, polite nations in the world, there is no occasion to answer them, for they stand self-condemned. George III never bought or sold a slave, he never owned a slave. He never invested in the companies that did that. He, of course, signed the legislation that abolished the slave trade in 1807. And yet for 2 centuries, ladies and gentlemen, he's essentially been held in a sort of lower moral plane by the Whig historians on both sides of the Atlantic. Certainly a lower moral plane than the signatories of the Declaration of Independence, 42 out of 56 of whom were slave owners. So I think that we can look anew at George III. And another important sense is that he was attacked at that time in 1776 by Thomas Paine, the pamphleteer, who sold the largest number of any pamphlet of the 18th century, Common Sense. And in it, he accused George III, and that was a long ad hominem attack on George III as well. And in it, he called him the Royal Brute of Britain, trying to make him out to be a brutish character. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the man who set up the Royal Academy, who attempting to create a higher status for artists in society. He was somebody who built up a private collection of 80,000 books, which today form the kernel of the British Library. When you go to the British Library and see that 5-story collection of books, those are George III's books. And he allowed people, scholars, to just come into Buckingham House, people like Joseph Priestley and Dr. Johnson, and use his private library. He is the person who built up or bought half of the Royal Collection, which is today the largest art collection in private hands. He was an absolutely key figure in the Georgian architecture movement, the neoclassical movement, in which he brought on architects such as Robert Adam and William Chambers, James Wyatt, and so on. He was the person who brought Mozart to play at Buckingham House, who tried to keep Joseph Haydn in London, and of whom Handel said, "While that boy lives, playing music needs no other champion." When he had, when William Herschel discovered the planet Uranus, he originally named it after George III, because George III had put up so much money for the largest telescope in the world at that time, through which Herschel discovered the planet. Ladies and gentlemen, this man is the exact opposite of a brute. He is in fact an Enlightenment figure. Indeed, in many areas, he's actually on the cutting edge of the Enlightenment. When you go to the 2nd floor of the Science Museum in London, there's an entire floor dedicated to the scientific instruments that he collected, which at one point was the largest collection of scientific instruments in the world. Born and bred in this country, he said in his first speech to the state opening of Parliament in 1761, "I glory in the name of Britain." He was the first king for well over 200 years to actually be born and educated in Britain, and that made him popular. He spoke English as his first language, which of course his father and grandfather and great-grandfather had not. And he was also popular because he was interested in agriculture. He was nicknamed Farmer George, originally by intellectuals who wanted to poke fun at him, but actually the name caught on because at that stage 80% of his subjects took their livelihood from agriculture, and they liked the fact that he wrote articles for agricultural journals about crop rotation and manure. And things like that. He's certainly the only king of England ever to write about manure. He started off with a tremendously unhappy childhood after the age of 12, when his father suddenly died. His father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, suddenly died of an aneurysm. And his upbringing was taken over to an extent by his grandfather, George II. There is something systemic in the Hanoverian dynasty whereby something incredibly dysfunctional in the generational aspect of the Hanoverian dynasty, whereby they all hate their children and parents. It goes down from generation to generation, apart from George III, who loved his father. I think it comes to an absolute sort of apogee when, after the death of Frederick, Prince of Wales, his own father, George II, refused to have his son's corpse buried. And instead, it lay decomposing in the bedroom above George III's, this 12-year-old boy, until such a point as it was putrefying to such a degree that finally it had to be buried at Westminster Abbey. But that's the kind of family relationship that George III grew up with. But he didn't allow it to continue. He it was the only one of the Hanoverian dynasty to love his wife, to be uxorious, not to take a mistress. He met his wife, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, some 6 hours before they got married. And then they had and then quite extraordinarily and very unusually for that dynasty, as I say, they fell in love. And they had 15 children, and it was a tremendously happy marriage until, as I'll come on to later, the king's malady, as it was called, his madness, meant that they had to separate. This isn't in any sense, my book is not in any sense a hagiography. There are plenty of things that were wrong and bad about the king. He was tremendously self-righteous. He never thought he got anything wrong, which, considering that the loss of the American colonies was the greatest catastrophe to overcome my country, really between the loss of the Angevin lands in the 15th century right the way down to the fall of France in 1940, was quite something. He also, it can't be said he had very much of a sense of humour. He had what I call a Hanoverian sense of humour. It's always said that the Hanoverians laughed at nothing so much as when you caught your finger in the door. It's entirely reminiscent of that old Mel Brooks line, what's the opposite of comedy? Germany. It was luckily not such an impediment, not such an incubus for my book, because, of course, the late 18th century was the high spot of parliamentary wit and repartee and so on. So I was able to insert a lot of the sort of best jokes of the 18th century. I know that a lot of you have heard this one, but it's my favourite joke of the late 18th century, so I'm going to tell it anyway. Was when the Earl of Sandwich was denouncing the radical journalist John Wilkes, the Earl of Sandwich, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty under George III. And he was denouncing John Wilkes, and he said that Wilkes would either die of the pox or on the gallows. And Wilkes replied, well, that depends, Your Lordship, on whether or not I embrace Your Lordship's principles or your mistress. He was, George III was a tremendously courageous man personally. He dealt with each of his 6 assassination attempts with immense sang-froid. I think the best of them was when somebody shot at him as an opera was about to start, and he went to sleep at the interval. He was very brave in the 1779 attempted invasion and in the 1803 to 5 attempted invasions, and then in the Gordon riots, 1780, June 1780, a week of the most terrible rioting, anti-Catholic rioting in central London, which caused more damage to London than anything else between the Great Fire of London in 1666 and the London Blitz of 1940 to 41. And during that time, the King's aide-de-camp says that the King did not know what fear was. And he also showed tremendous courage during his malady, because in these terrible attacks of manic depression, his doctors, who knew nothing about how properly to deal with this, would straitjacket him for days on end. They attached him to a chair which was nailed to the floor. They cupped him, which was a terrible thing whereby you attached a cup to the arm or the thigh and heat it up in order to create artificial blistering. Incredibly painful, form of torture essentially. And they bled him. They took large amounts of blood from him. And needless to say, ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly the worst thing to do to somebody who is suffering from manic depression. My book's the first book about the first major cradle to the grave life of George III for half a century. And so I was able to write this in an atmosphere where finally, thank God, we've been able to destigmatize mental illness. And the King can no longer be accused, as he was by the Whig historians for 2 centuries, of essentially being responsible for his own madness, guilty of his own madness, and somehow morally weak as a result of it. So as I say, tremendously brave man. And then when he got cataracts in his eyes, the doctors put leeches on his eyeballs, which also must have been tremendously painful. The King wasn't responsible for what was called the Germain Plan, the one strategic plan really that the British had during the American War of Independence, which was the brainchild of Lord George Germain, the American Secretary at Whitehall. And the idea was to get Sir William Howe down in New Orleans to come up the Hudson River to coalesce with Sir John Burgoyne, who was coming down from Canada, and to meet around Albany, and thereby, through the control of the Hudson, split the New England colonies off from the rest of the American colonies. That was the big plan. And as Jay mentioned, Sir William Howe instead veered off eastwards to capture this city, the rebel capital, and to occupy it for 9 months. And as a result, Sir John Burgoyne was captured at Saratoga in October 1777 with his entire army. And at that point, 4 months later, the French, of course, got into the war, declared war against Britain on the American side. The French are always there when they need you. And in the following year, in 1779, the Spanish declared war, and in 1780, the Dutch. And so suddenly, what was a colonial conflict, and not one that was going well, Britain never actually, at any one time, had more than 50,000 troops fighting in America, which was a ridiculously small number considering there were 2.5 million Americans. And the country was 1,800 miles from top to bottom in 1775. It was never enough, but large amounts had to be taken away from the American theatre in order to fight everywhere else in the world against the Dutch, French, and Spanish. We were fighting in the East Indies, in the West Indies, in the Channel, in the Mediterranean, where, of course, Gibraltar was subjected to a grueling 1,000-day siege, and ultimately also in America too. And in Africa. So the combination of not having very good generals, not having enough men, trying to bring logistically everything over the 3,000 plus miles of the Atlantic, and also facing an extraordinary concatenation of genius in the American leadership. You have, in what other decade can you fit into one decade a polymath like Benjamin Franklin, a charismatic leader, military leader like George Washington, a wordsmith like Thomas Jefferson, somebody who understands finance in the way that Alexander Hamilton did, a political genius like John Adams and at Madison and Monroe. I mean, the idea that you should have had all of those people all in that key decade is infuriating. When the defeat took place and John Adams came as the first ambassador to the court of St. James in June 1785, King George said this at the first audience. I'll be very frank with you. I was the last to consent to the separation, but the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I've always said, and I say now, that I will be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power. And he also said when in March 1797, George Washington retired as president, that George Washington was the greatest character of the age. I think that was gracious of him. He was unfortunate that in the 14, he was king for longer than any other king of England, nearly 60 years. And he was very unfortunate that in all that time, of the 14 prime ministers that he appointed, only 2 of them were really remarkable politicians and statesmen. William Pitt the Younger, who was William Pitt the Elder, who unfortunately was far too infirm by the time of the American War of Independence, of the American Revolution, and William Pitt the Younger, his son, who of course was a great man by the time of the Napoleonic Wars, but was too young at the time of the American War of Independence. But they did learn the lessons, including George III, learned the lessons of the American Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars and French Revolutionary Wars were fought in a far more impressive way. Although by the time that the victory came in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo, for 5 years already, the king had been not only blind and deaf, but also senile, and he had this manic depression as well. So the last 10 years of his life are frankly very pathos laden. I think that the great legacy of George III today is one of the modern monarchy. He was the man who bought Buckingham House, present-day Buckingham Palace. He bought the Gold State Coach, which is being renovated at the moment for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. He insisted on the royal walkabout, on the royal enclosure at Ascot, the annual trooping of the colour. He was the first king since Charles I to be buried at Windsor, since when all of the monarchs have been. And so rather than his granddaughter, Queen Victoria, who often gets the accolade for being the creator of the modern monarchy, I think in fact it was the Queen's great-great-great-great-grandfather. And when one looks at Her Majesty the Queen today and sees the frugality in eating and drinking and the financial prudence and the commitment to hard work and duty, you see all of that in her ancestor George III. So to conclude, I was in Washington recently when I went to look at the Declaration of Independence and looking for loopholes. And I found that, I know you must all know this, but nonetheless, the National Archives have put a trigger warning on it that says that the things that are stated in the Declaration, some of the things that are stated in the Declaration are, and I quote, outdated, biased, and offensive. Ladies and gentlemen, anyone who reads an 18th century document and doesn't think it's going to be outdated is frankly a moron. There's no other way of putting it. But it is, I know, a great debate, and has been a great debate in your country about whether or not America is an exceptional country. And it strikes me very strongly that there have been any number of other peoples throughout history who have demanded their independence and self-government and their sovereignty because they were being oppressed. One thinks of the Israelites against the Egyptians, the Dutch against the Spanish, the Italians against the Austrians, the Greeks against the Turks, and so on. But what actually makes America exceptional, I believe, is that you demanded and stood up for your independence and self-government against the people who were not oppressing you, and a king who was not a tyrant. Thank you very much.
So let me get this straight. We're all morons here. Andrew, this has been a fantastic talk. I'm happy to be your straight man on any occasion. Now, I was remiss in not announcing at the beginning of your talk that we will have time for questions from the floor and also questions from our Zoom audience, which I'm happy to see is north of 120. And they can submit it via the Q&A function, and those questions will be read after we have the questions from the floor. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Very good.
Thank you.
Okay, who would like to start things off? I would ask you to speak loudly into the microphone so that everyone in the Zoom audience can hear. You're second. Here you go.
Okay, assuming that there's no provable answer to the question, would slavery have been abolished in the colonies if we had not rebelled against England earlier? Would we have abolished slavery in what we now term as the United States if the American Revolution had not taken place?
Well, as you say, it's impossible to prove, but of course, slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire in 1833. We didn't have to kill 700,000 of our countrymen to do that. And it was always legal as well, as the Mansfield Judgment of 1772 established. Ever since Magna Carta, there was no such thing as slavery in Britain. And when a slave trod on British soil, he was automatically freed. So you would have had the American War of Independence not taken place, you would have had undoubtedly a huge clash. It would entirely depend on the constitutional arrangements, because Britain was willing to give representation. This was something certainly by 1778 in the Carlisle Peace Commission. If the Americans had wanted representation in the House of Commons, they would have got it. So then they would have been involved in the clash between the Whigs and the Tories, and abolitionism obviously was a political issue up until 1833. So my belief is that yes, it would have come sooner, but it's impossible to say. I mean, there would have been, if we're going to do the what if, can I give you another one? Because of course, had somehow our two peoples, stayed in a condominium of some form, even if the centre of power had moved from London to New York at some stage in the 19th century. If the two powers had stayed together that essentially became the British Empire and the American Republic, there is simply no way that the Kaiser could have declared war on us in 1914. You wouldn't have had, therefore, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Nazis, or the Holocaust. So the world would have been a much happier place.
Yes, Andrew, I accept your commentary and its enlightenment. Why, however, has it taken 246 years for a lack of counter commentaries that have already started on this subject?
Thank you. I think it's a number of things. First of all, the complete domination by the Whig historians of the historiography of the 19th century was extraordinary, really. The Trevelyan, father and son, Macaulay, and others were able to sort of stamp their view that the king was a tyrant and wanted to overthrow. They even accused him of trying to overthrow liberty in England. And I'm afraid Edmund Burke goes a long way to stating that as well, at least up until the time of the French Revolution, when in his great reflections he sort of grew out of all of that. But it was a terrible thing that that there wasn't any kind of Tory view of history rather than just the Whig view of history. And even people who I respect enormously, like Winston Churchill, went along with this idea that, that George III was attempting to increase the power of the crown during his reign. He wasn't. He never tried to veto a bill. He only on one occasion appointed a prime minister who didn't have the support of the majority of the House of Commons, and that was William Pitt the Younger, the 24-year-old, when the radical Whigs were attempting to nationalise the East India Company for their own benefit. And on that occasion, the electorate validated George III's decision by giving Pitt the Younger a landslide victory at the subsequent general election.
Over here. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I had a quick question about militarily. You talked about how the British Empire was fighting on a number of fronts and the distribution of those troops, and that 50,000 were dispersed here in the United States, what would become the United States. How involved was George III in those types of military decisions, or was he trusted by his generals, or did they pretty much rule the roost in that regard?
Well, he was responsible for sort of putting ticks against their names for their promotion. There's a document where you see Cornwallis, Howe, Burgoyne, and Clinton all with ticks next to their names for becoming major generals. And so in that sense, he was, I suppose, responsible because they were four pretty useless generals. However, he didn't, it was the commander-in-chief who appointed them, and he was essentially just sort of not crossing their names out. He didn't come up with strategy at all. He understood. He was the first king of England for 200 years who had never served in any military capacity. And so he also recognized that he didn't have that expertise. He allowed the various professional soldiers to work out the strategy. So he wasn't responsible for that. And so, yes, overall, I think he's been wildly too much criticized for the defeat.
You can't fault your generals too much. They were here for 9 months, so that was an accomplishment.
Well, they enjoyed it there. Nobody else seems to mind.
We're happy to have the library company people with us today, including Mike Prasanti, the director. And if you have time after the talk, we can wander over and show you some relics from the Meschianza, which was, you're familiar with that, the bull that the then Captain Andre, before he was elevated, and dropped, right, before he's elevated to major and then to a tree limb. Or organized for the Bells of Philadelphia.
Fantastic. I'd love to
Yes,
see that.
well, a few of them ended up on your side of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
But we can show you that. Anyway, next please.
How much culpability do you think Lord North deserves as opposed to George III?
A huge amount, a huge amount. He was actually a tremendously successful manager of the House of Commons. He was able to in the early part of his premiership, because he became prime minister in 1770, and so for the first 4 or 5 years until the outbreak of the revolution, he had established himself as an extremely effective prime minister. He was very good with finance and so on. But when it came to war, he was utterly useless. He didn't consider himself to be a prime minister who needed to worry about the war. He thought all of that could be done by Lord George Germain anyway. He allowed the terrible clashes to take place between the First Lord of the Admiralty and the Secretary of War, who hated each other. Then later on, further on down the in the departments, the Admiralty and the War Department clashed constantly. They both clashed with the Treasury. To send, and of course, the victualling of an army 3,500 miles away was a tremendously complicated process. and every department of state seemed to hate every other department of state. And what Lord North needed to do was to crack heads together, and he didn't see it as his constitutional duty to do that. He just thought of himself as primus inter pares. He wasn't even called prime minister. The term didn't exist until the 19th century. He saw himself as just the top man, but not somebody whose job it was to control the government. And so he made, I counted them up once, I think it's 16 demands to resign. And here George III can be held culpable because he didn't let him resign. If somebody doesn't want to do a top job like Prime Minister, then he shouldn't, and he should be allowed to move. But he looked around, George III looked around to see who else could have taken the post. And people like Sandwich and Viscount Barrington and Lord George Germain all had sort of big problems, not least in how they got on with everybody else in the cabinet. The only person everybody actually liked personally was Lord North. So it's a, I go into this, as you can imagine, in some detail in my book. The personalities are tremendously important in all of this, and Lord North was culpable in not insisting on resigning earlier, but he'd gone broke and he'd borrowed the present-day equivalent of about $6 million from the king. And so he was very much under the king's, if the king said you stay, then it was either that or bankruptcy.
We have a number of questions in the room. I think at this point, I just want to turn it over a bit to Jessica from APS. Could you read some of the Q&As from our Zoom audience, and then I'll return to questions in the room.
Sure, I will. Our first question is from Lorraine. Colonists seem to shift from asking for independence based on the rights of Englishmen to natural law. Was there any theory that would have convinced Parliament to grant independence?
I don't think so without bloodshed. That doesn't happen really in human history until Norway and Sweden split up in 1905. Otherwise, every time a state attempts to secede, hardly need to tell Americans this, considering what happens in the 19th century, it winds up with bloodshed. So I'm afraid we came up, by 1930, we came up with a concept at the Statute of Westminster of the Commonwealth, whereby the king whereby the British Parliament at Westminster has no power over Canada and Australia and New Zealand's internal affairs and so on. But that is such an advanced concept. You get it by 1930. It's certainly nothing like that, even in embryo in the 1770s.
Next, Jessica.
Sure. We have one from Wayne Strasbaugh. Was George III involved in promoting the abolition of slavery in Canada?
No, not directly, not that I've been able to see.
Next.
Okay, and then Bob Frischman asks, we know that King George III noted the exact time on his papers as he wrote them. Does your book address his keen interest in clocks and watches, collecting and studying them? We do also know of his active support of John Harrison receiving the Longitude Prize.
It's all in the book. He's a huge horologist, and he did enjoy all that, and he did insist on Harrison getting the prize, and there are lots of other aspects of his interest in clocks and watches. Yes.
By the way, no surprise that question came from one of America's top horologists. Jessica, do you have another?
We have one more on here. Dreda Heckscher asks, when did George III cease to be able to function as a monarch?
Well, he ceased, of course, for a few months, for about 6 months in 1788, until early 1779, then again in 1801 for a few months, then again in 1804, then finally from 1810, for the last 10 years of his life, he was too ill to be able to function. I think really the point where he started to go blind in 1804, 1805 also was a major moment where the politicians tended to to run the country much more than they had before. So I'd say about 1804 is answers to that.
You're doing a very good job from the dispatch box. Now a hard question from Steve Ujafuza, a maritime expert.
Well, it's not a maritime related question, but the question I have is the relationship between him and his son, the Prince of Wales. Was it it was famously dysfunctional. Was it the classic family hatred, or did it have to do with policy and visions for the monarchy?
All of the above, and more, and also the king, and also, well, in the 3 years that it took me to research and write this book, I wasn't able to find a single redeeming feature for George, Prince of Wales. He was a terrible, terrible man, and just utterly horrible human being. And there's one point actually, financially, although there are any number of other aspects of his personality that are disgusting, but nonetheless, the one that George III found most difficult really was the fact that he had compulsive buying disorder, whereby he just bought things without asking how much they cost or anything about them, and built up these enormous debts, knowing that one day he was going to be king and Parliament was going to have to, the taxpayer was going to have to pay them off. And there's one point where his debts actually equaled the amount that we were paying for the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars, which is truly extraordinary. So yes, unfortunately, there's the systemic thing. It's called the reversionary interest, whereby the Prince of Wales is always essentially set up in opposition to his father, because the politicians that group around the Prince of Wales know that they will become the government, and that the ones who are actually in the government at the time will be dismissed when the Prince of Wales becomes king.
In the Middle Temple, there are several plaques of where the individuals are memorialized who were involved in the quest for American independence. Obviously, these were men of privilege, and they had been sent to England to be educated, and England sounded relatively stable at that point. What do you think it was that turned them into a position where they were willing to risk everything they had for the American cause?
I think it was this dawning realization, as I mentioned, that America was going to, that the colonies would do better independently rather than as part of an empire. You know, it was a long intellectual battle fought largely by pamphlets in those days, but also in discussion, in things like your library here, and the interaction between these people. Then, of course, once the Stamp Act had gone horribly wrong as far as Britain was concerned, and the Intolerable Acts were brought in, the Boston Tea Party as a result of the Boston Tea Party and so on, there were the necessary sparks that actually turn men to consider bloodshed. So it's a combination, I think, of these long intellectual feuds, and then right at the end, a series of absolute make or break moments. With regard to the Stamp Act, it was trying to raise something between 40 and 60,000 pounds amongst 2.5 million people. So it only fell about 2 shillings and sixpence per American per year, and all the money was going to be spent in America. But the trouble was that it fell on journalists and lawyers. And as was said sometime in the 19th century, it doesn't pay to fall out with people who buy ink by the barrel load.
Ted, I expected a harder question from the head of the Magna Carta Society. Thank you anyway. And now Jay Hill, who was kind enough to recommend the speaker.
Andrew, may I shift the focus a bit? Many of us have read your books, volumes, large volumes, Napoleon, George III, Churchill, leadership, might even be described as tomes. Could you say something about your writing day, how you do research over 3 years on a person like George III, and maybe your team of research assistants?
I've never employed a single research assistant in my whole life. I'm told by my friends that they always take more time than they say. Because you have to check everything, because if they plagiarize something and then you put it into your book, you're accused of plagiarism, which is obviously the worst thing that a historian can be accused of. So I've never used a research assistant. Instead, what I do is to start work at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning every day. And that gives you a good 4 hours before people disturb you, my children in this case. So that's a sort of help. Then in the afternoon, I take a 45-minute Churchillian nap every afternoon. I've done that since I was at Cambridge 40 years ago. And I find that rejuvenates you for a bit more work in the late afternoon. With regards to the research part, well, you just fling yourself into the primary sources. So if working on something like Churchill, who has had 1,009 biographies written of him, mine was the 1,010th, you obviously can't spend too much time on the secondary material. You go straight to Churchill College, Cambridge in this case, for the primary material. With the Royal Archives, of course, with George III, that was a great place, and the papers of the people who worked with George III were pretty much in the British Library. My next biography is going to be of Benjamin Disraeli, and that's going to be great because his papers are at the Bodleian, which is a wonderful place to work in Oxford, and also in the British Library. So that's the thing. I'm not one of these writers who can write bits of the book and then bring them all the bits together at the end. It strikes me that it's just too risky, because what if you come across a piece of evidence that undermines something that you'd spent weeks working on? No. So instead, I try and get all the evidence beforehand before I write a word, and then I concentrate that on in as short a period of time as possible. It's really a sort of wrap a whole cold towel around your head and try to churn out 4,000 words a day.
Jessica, may we have one from the Zoom audience?
We have one more that popped up. This is a total topic change. As a historian, you must be following the invasion of Ukraine with great interest. First, what is Vladimir Putin's ultimate goal? And second, how should Western governments respond to his decision to send troops into Ukraine?
I don't think that really is necessarily the job of a historian to predict. I think a psychiatrist might help with regards to Mr. Putin, but I'm not sure a historian will necessarily. He obviously, with regard to history, he very obviously does consider Ukraine to be an invalid country. The last 30 years mean nothing to him. The separateness of the Ukraine within the Russian people from the mid-19th century onwards also mean nothing to him. The appalling way that Stalin killed 3 million plus Ukrainians deliberately in collectivization through confiscation of food means nothing to Mr. Putin. The fact that Kharkov survived 4 sieges in between 1941 and 1944 can't mean anything to him either. I think that he is showing a tremendous ignorance of Ukraine and its history. And I wouldn't be in the slightest bit surprised, but again, this is prognostication rather than anything to do with history. If he gets an extremely bloody nose in the long run, if they have a partisan struggle, and I think if any people in Europe would be up for that, it would be the Ukrainians.
Thank you for not expressing an opinion on that. Our next question is from Bob Hauser from the APS.
Given the way you described your style of work, I wonder at what point you came to the realization that this work would largely redeem the reputation of George III in the eyes of the reader.
Not until I sat down to write it. For the first 2.5 years I mean, obviously you're thinking about it all the time, but for the first 2.5 years, I wasn't certain that I was going to write a positive book. But then once all the evidence was in, I recognized that the 19th century books were next to useless, that a lot of the people who were taught by, a classic example, let me take an example, Sir Jack Plum, who was a hugely respected historian, Cambridge historian. He taught many of the people who taught me. So under normal circumstances, you should sort of nod towards Sir Jack Plum, who I once met when I was an undergraduate. But when you read his stuff on George III, he was writing in the 1950s, but he wrote at one point that George III went mad because he was forced to make love to his hideous wife. You think you can't have misogynistic, stupid, unscientific rubbish like that. You know, it's time for rehabilitation. And so I didn't recognize that until I started writing. But whilst I was writing, you know, more and more of my efforts came forward. And I hope when you read this book with a completely objective mind, despite being in Philadelphia, you will recognize that there is another side to this man.
Rachel Hammer from the Library Company.
Thank you for a phenomenal talk, honestly. Question about how you get the inspiration to choose your subject matter, your content. King George, Benjamin Disraeli. I'm curious how you come to that decision, what goes into it.
Yes. Well, I think with Disraeli, it's what I very much do look for is, as well as not caring if somebody's had been written about 1,000 times before. So what I do like, of course, is like with George III, nobody having done him for 50 years. There hasn't been a great single volume biography of Disraeli since Robert Blake in 1966. And that is such a long time, and so much scholarship has been done since then. And there are so many areas that Robert, who again I knew and admired, didn't cover. That you can see a sort of gap in the market, to put it in its crudest terms. But with Disraeli, there's also an adventure story. You have somebody who did not go to school. He wasn't schooled at one of the great English public schools. He was home educated. He didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. He was Jewish and therefore a complete outsider when it came to the very aristocratic and anti-Semitic and snobbish Conservative Party of the 19th century. And he got to the top of that party. And then he became Prime Minister of Britain at a time when Britain had the largest empire the world's ever seen. So it's he did it entirely through his own wit, his own brilliance, his repartee, his timing, political timing, and so on. So it's the way I'm going to try and write it anyway is going to be as an extraordinary adventure story.
Were the archives of George III that were recently released, were they instrumental in you changing your mind about him? And is that, would you say, the defining moment for this book and his historiography for George III?
I don't think anyone can write another biography of George III now without at least taking on my my view, my opinions on this. I think it would be difficult for a historian to just ignore my revisionist, essentially, rehabilitation. With regard to these, whether or not it's going to change anyone's mind long term, I'm afraid the answer is probably no, owing to the fact that I subscribe in George III's name to Google Alerts. And every single day there is something in America that is published either in a newspaper or a website that talks about the monstrous tyranny of George III. It doesn't seem to have in any way lessened, and I'm not sure it's going to. But anyway, one lives in hope.
I wouldn't ordinarily give the last question to a Balliol man with a Keys Fellow at the podium, but he also serves as Her Majesty's honorary consul here. So Oliver Franklin, you have the floor.
I bow to Gonville and Keys. I want you to know officially right now. But when your book came out, I was so excited. I ran Barnes and Noble, and as I was picking it up, I realized the pandemic hadn't me. I hadn't gone to the gym in a year. And so my wife says, well, I'm struggling. So I got an ebook and I got the Audible, and I was enthralled by the entire book. I was bowled over by the wit, the way you were able to get those documents and the way you framed your argument. So I want to thank you. I've never had such a good time reading about someone I thought I knew, but I realized I knew him through George, who was the madness of King George. I mean, that's all I knew about King George. I've seen the movie a couple of times. You know, that man's crazy. That's why we won. But, and also thank you for your kind letter. I think it was a TLS. It was very polite when you said, I didn't want to protest because you gave me a very nice review. But yes, I did have the abolition in the book. Remember that? I think it was TLS along with your book. That was very Gonville and Giesman. I want you to know. But you did talk about his early abolitionism. And I did read that essay that he wrote, I think it was in the TLS, about it. And then I began to read the Declaration of Independence differently, particularly when the king incites the populace to rebel. I always knew it was giving Africans arms to fight for their freedom. I wondered how many of the intellectuals, Southern intellectuals, actually knew about the king's, as you would say, as he got older, incipient abolitionism, and what impact that had in this desire to break away. Because you're right, the king was not a tyrant. The parliament gave him everything they wanted, which shocked me. Everything they wanted, but they still broke away. And I just wondered what you felt about that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it's often been alleged that it was out of fear of the abolition of slavery that the Southern owners went for independence. I wasn't, and I've read the relevant pieces on this. I wasn't convinced of that. I thought that that they, apart from the Mansfield judgment, there was no movement by the British to extend abolitionism to the United States before the outbreak of the revolution. The Mansfield judgment only applied to England. There was no sense that it was going to be extended, and so I think that that it probably was not such a, I mean, it should have been, but it wasn't.
Thank you, Oliver. Very much appreciate your remarks.